Yeah, Arnold just said it would be a very short speech. Now. We've already had people throw out extremes of Ayn Rand and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, so I was trying to look for a middle road. I don't know if I'll succeed. So the title today is Good Things About Capitalism, and for those of you who've heard me sing labor songs or rant about social justice, you might have thought I was kidnapped by Martians, replacing the socialist Hugh with the capitalist Hugh. It's simpler than that. I have been bought off. As you heard, this talk's a result of moolah, cash, bread, money, dinero, loot, greenbacks, wampum, the almighty dollar. Gary O'Rourke outbid others and got to choose the topic for today's talk, Good Things About Capitalism. So, it's an intriguing challenge. I'm going to do what I can. It's probably a good exercise for our community here at 1906 Rittenhouse because like any liberal, progressive community, we can also be caught by groupthink. We can be taken over by our political passions, and we can be blinded and impatient to the diversity that we claim we profess. So, can ethical culture honor its commitment to inherent worth, to every person, to ethical relationships, and to social justice, while at the same time embracing some characteristics historically associated with capitalism? I think so. Certainly not the vicious capitalism of Goldman Sachs, but I do think ethical humanism can embrace healthy competition, incentive, innovation, hard work, efficiency, better goods and services, and perhaps reasonable respect for private property. That's what I'm going to try to convince you of. Now, most of these characteristics are good in moderation and not good in extreme, that's clear. So to bring out the best of capitalism, I do think that reasonable regulations are necessary, like those were offered by the progressives and by New Deal regulation. Capitalism is not, like some people try to convince you, a force of nature that somehow we have to accept. I think it should bring out our best. And to do that, we can't just be passive consumers or inattentive investors. We have to be citizens. Active citizens that demand that capitalism serve our highest ideals. And that's where I'm going to end up today. It's certainly what Felix Adler, who founded Ethical Culture, believed. He appreciated some of what capitalism had to offer. He understood that things, however, had gone dreadfully wrong. In his mind, the radical correction that was necessary was not socialism, however, but it was reform fueled by humanist ideals, and behind it all was a belief that human beings can be transformed. He was optimistic, maybe more optimistic than I am, that ethical transformation of individuals can change the system from within. That's not my main focus today, though. So, to examine what's good about capitalism, I'm going to try to, again, rely on history, my favorite teacher. And I think it's important to look at this in particular because it's very easy to sort of take for granted what capitalism has given us. I think it's easy to take for granted all our gadgets and our comforts, which, if we're honest with ourselves, we want. It's easy to romanticize the good old days before crazed consumerism and bureaucracy and pollution. But let's not forget that life in, well, let's say the Middle Ages was pretty brutal. And this was a time when kings hoarded wealth, lives were shorter, comforts were scarce. Andrew Carnegie, who wrote The Gospel of Wealth, said, "Let's remember, the good old times were not good old times." So, let's go to some more history. In pre-capitalist feudal societies, I think kings and queens certainly inherited absolute power, and the average life was one of toil. All people that were not wealthy were basically subject to slaving in the fields with animals and iron in order to get a little bit of food, part of which they had to give to their king for supposed protection. And that protection earned you the right to serve in the king's army. It wasn't until sufficient capital combined with skill and technology that a merchant class began to emerge, capable of challenging the arbitrary rule of kings. Capitalism created the middle class that was necessary for democracy. More stakeholders demanded more power. And I didn't have to go to capitalists for this. Robert Reich writes in his book, Supercapitalism, The Transformation of Business, Democracy, and Everyday Life, He says capitalism is almost certainly a precondition for democracy, as Milton Friedman argued. Democracy requires private centers of economic power independent of a central authority. Otherwise, people can't dissent from official orthodoxy and also feed their families. So early on, both wealth and economic power, which was held by a relatively select few, made life difficult, but slowly that wealth began to be spread further. Andrew Carnegie said, much better for a great irregularity than for universal squalor. So the middle class did enjoy more goods and services than anyone could imagine only a few generations before. Again, the gospel of wealth. He writes, today the world obtains commodities of excellent quality at prices which even the generation preceding would have deemed incredible. The poor enjoy what the rich could not before afford. Now, this new abundance was due in part to new forms of capitalist organization. For example, take the Virginia Company. This was the company that founded Jamestown in 1607, and it was really the first corporation. It was a joint stock company, and it issued shared ownership through pooled resources, which shared risk among many people led to greater accumulation of wealth, greater investment, and allowed the opening up of business to the middle class. Now, this was a revolution in some ways of business ownership and of social organization. Alongside that revolution, I admit there were some ugly things that grew in the soil of Jamestown, like, starvation and tobacco and indentured servants and slavery and a holocaust of slavery that would kill and torture millions of people whose blood and sweat dampened the soil and left us with the aching wounds of the Civil War, Jim Crow, a prison industrial complex that devastates millions of impoverished neighborhoods today, but that's not today's talk. Not all that can be blamed on capitalism. So maybe the good things are easier to find north of Jamestown in some of the New England colonies. So let's go to the Pilgrims, who, believe it or not, did embrace some capitalism. Now, they were more interested in honoring God than in making money. That's true. They were on a mission to build a godly city upon a hill, and they focused more on the success of the group than on individual process. The group was more important. But even within that communal environment, strains of Yankee merchant culture began to creep in. While at first their agricultural system was very communally based, after a bad harvest and a long winter, the Pilgrims embraced individualism and competition because they found that self-interest and incentive promoted growth. So the Plymouth colony's governor, William Bradford, wrote in his diary the following words. He said, "And so we assigned to every family a parcel of land according to the proportion of their number. They had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious. So as much more corn was planted than it otherwise would have been by any means the governor could have used, and saved him a great deal of trouble and gave better content. The women now willingly went to the field and took their little ones to set corn, which before they would have alleged weakness and inability. Whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression." So he said, I could have forced them, but rather than that, I just gave them a little incentive. I said, this is your land, go for it. So the people produced more. They were proud of what they produced. They believed that it honored themselves, their families, their village, and God. Now, nevertheless, the Pilgrims still had about 90% of the indigenous population wiped out by disease. That helped, that's true. But they did acquire private property, and they believed that that was praiseworthy. Harvests were reaped, children were saved from being starving, houses were built. Some of that is good, I believe. Certainly our founding mothers and fathers thought it was good and thought private property was okay, because that's really what caused the American Revolution. I mean, we like to think the American Revolution was a result of rights and capital letter ideals, but really it was a victory for money. Due to the debts that the British incurred during an extensive and expensive war, they began to tax the colonies after 200 years of not taxing them. And that's really what got the colonies angry. Duties and excise taxes began to invade what the colonists assumed was their God-given right to own property. So the revolution wasn't really a revolution. I mean, the same people who had money, power, and property before the revolution had it after the revolution. The same people, except for a small group of loyalists that were sent back to Britain. So I don't know whether I would have fought a revolution over private property, but I have to admit that I enjoy it. And I think you do too. I enjoy my father's guitar, that's my property. I enjoy the fact that my home, where I raised my family, has been relatively safe from people taking property. So, is property theft, as the liberal socialist turned anarchist Proudhon said, or is it something that we should care about and defend? It brought our country into existence, and I'm not willing to give all mine away yet. So, along with private property, another arguably good characteristic of capitalism is innovation. Innovation. This is a quality that was embraced by scientific American entrepreneurs like Ben Franklin. Now, Franklin loved private property too. He wasn't averse to making some money. He also liked other capitalist qualities like industry and frugality. You know, his expressions, early bird gets the worm, or penny saved is a penny earned. Those are his semi-capitalist sayings. Now, while much of Franklin's innovation was due to, I think, a natural scientific curiosity, he was also driven by entrepreneurship. He may not have known what the study of electricity would have gotten him, but he was not just playing around when he was out in the thunderstorm flying his kite. He searched for practical improvements that might serve and comfort human beings. So from improvements on eyeglasses and stoves and maps of the vitally important Gulf Stream trade routes, there was money to be made, and that helped spur innovation. Few of his inventions had such dramatic effect, actually, as, you know, the one that had the greatest economic impact immediately? Anybody know? Lightning rods. Lightning rods, because there was a crisis in the insurance companies, in England in particular, where lightning started to strike more and more high steeples of churches. And having figured out how to channel electricity into the ground, Franklin suggested that they start putting rods on the tops of their tall buildings to channel the electricity. And suddenly fires in Europe almost disappeared overnight. There was more money being saved, less fires were raging through these very packed cities. The insurance companies were in the black, there was more investments inside these now less fire vulnerable cities and financial centers around Europe. And I think that's a good thing. Franklin, in fact, didn't even use his right to patent that because he wanted it to serve the public good, at least at this point. But there was an American patent system that was trying to reward capitalism. It's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and it allows Congress to, quote, promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. In other words, those people who figured out useful things were allowed to profit from them for a while. Eli Whitney profited from the cotton gin, which was a good thing certainly for clothing manufacturing. It was a horrible thing for slaves, of course, who were pressured to pick more cotton to feed this insatiable industry. But again, that's another day's topic. But Whitney did profit from other things like interchangeable parts. If you spent time paying attention in your high school history class, you'll know that he figured out that things that were made with interchangeable parts were more easily to manufacture and more easy to repair. And it got him a lot of money, in particular when he applied it to guns. Because it impressed so much Jefferson and Adams that in 1797, when Congress voted to go to war with France in the Quasi-War, Eli Whitney was given a contract for 10,000 muskets. He was 8 years late in fulfilling that contract, but they were so pleased with the product, the quality and the repairability, that he got an additional contract for 15,000 muskets. So he was really our first national arms dealer. But nobody was better at profiting from patents than the Wizard of Menlo Park. You know him? Who is he? Thomas Edison. He held 1,093 U.S. patents. He brought us the light bulb, the phonograph, movie cameras, dozens of industries. And he was the most market-driven of all our entrepreneurs, really. He was more of a problem solver. I mean, he would pick up anything and say, How can I make this better so that people will buy it? And he had a factory of people working for him doing just that. He epitomized the entrepreneurial spirit that Ralph Waldo Emerson captured. I want to read a phrase. This is the Sage of Concord, our strongest philosophical influence in America, because he prayed, a lot of people pin this to Edison, that build a better mousetrap and the world will be a path to your door, right? So just do anything and you can make millions of dollars. You know those little plastic tabs that go around bread bags that used to have squishy ties? The person who invented that plastic thing is a multimillionaire just because of that product, because it's everywhere now you go. Well, the real words of Emerson were not quite that, but he did say this. He said, if a man has good corn or wood or boards or pigs to sell, or can make better chairs or knives or crucibles or church organs than anybody else you will find, then you will find a broad beaten road to his house, though it be through the woods. That was the actual one. And that seems fair. It seems fair to reward people for innovation. Emerson loved to throw praise on people who could take nature and channel it into human use. He spoke of how well we manipulate, quote, fire, steam, lightning, gravity, ledges of rocks, mines of iron, lead, quicksilver, tin and gold, forests of all woods, fruits of all climates, animals of all habitats, the powers of tillage, the fabrics of chemical laboratories, the webs of looms. So he cheered the fact that we went from being victims of nature to manipulators of nature. And I think that's a good thing. For the industrious person, Emerson said, quote, the world is his tool chest, and he is successful, or his education is carried on just so far as the marriage of his faculties and nature, putting together our brain and the natural world. So Emerson reflects this, basically the growth of the capitalist work ethic. In a book called Working Life, author Joanne Swiller explained that there was an evolution of attitudes towards work and the work ethic. This is relatively new. I didn't realize this until I was working on this, that we're really only talking about maybe 3 centuries where the work ethic is front and center in a lot of Western culture. She writes, the ancients saw work as a necessity and a curse. The medieval Catholic Church bestowed on work a simple dignity. The Renaissance humanists gave it glamour. But the Protestants endowed work with the quest for meaning, identity, and signs of salvation. So, for many settling our nation, work itself was a calling. Work for work's sake. Now, in colonial New England, hard work was praised in 19th century churches and schools and taverns and town halls. And in a series of booklets called primers, the lessons were very clear. There was one called McGuffey's Readers. Does anybody remember reading McGuffey's Readers in school? Yeah, they went through. This is the most popular primer. They sold 120 million copies from 1836 to 1960, which rivals Webster's Dictionary and the Bible in the United States, 4 editions. It was in one of those McGuffey's Readers that I found the following important little morality story that I want to read to you now. It's adapted from the story of Little Daffy Downdilly by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And this is a story about a boy named Hugh. True. Hugh was lazy. Rather than toil away, he preferred to be idle. So this once upon a time story is called Hugh Idle and Mr. Toil. All right? So, little capitalist story time now. Settle yourself. It's going to take a little while. Hugh Idle loved to do only what was agreeable and took no delight in labor of any kind. But while Hugh was yet a little boy, he was sent away from home and put under the care of a very strict schoolmaster who went by the name Mr. Toil. Those who knew him best affirmed that Mr. Toil was a very worthy character and that he had done more good, both to children and grown people, than anybody else in the world. He had, however, a severe and ugly countenance. His voice was harsh, and all his ways and customs were disagreeable to our young friend, Hugh Idle. The whole day long, this terrible schoolmaster skulked around his scholars with a big cane in hand, and unless a lad chose to attend constantly and quietly to his book, he had no chance of enjoying a single moment. "This will never do for me," thought Hugh. "I'll run off and try to find my way home." So the very next morning he started off, only with some bread and cheese for his breakfast, and very little pocket money to pay for expenses. He had gone but a short distance when he overtook a man of grave and sedate appearance trudging at a moderate pace along the road. "Good morning, my fine lad," said the stranger, and his voice seemed hard and severe, but he had sort of a kindness in it. "Whence do you come so early, and whither are you going?" Now Hugh was a boy of very frank disposition, and had never been known to tell a lie all his life. Nor did he tell one now, but confessed that he had run away from school on account of a great dislike of Mr. Toil. "Oh, very well, my little friend," answered the stranger, "then we will go together, for I likewise have had a good deal to do with Mr. Toil, and should be glad to find some place where he was never heard of." So they walked on very sociably side by side. By and by their road led them past a field where some haymakers were at work. Hugh could not help thinking how much pleasanter it would be to make hay in the sunshine, under the blue sky, than to learn lessons all day long, shut up in a dismal schoolroom, continually watched by Mr. Toil. But in the midst of these thoughts, while he was stopping to peep over the stone wall, he stared back and caught hold of his companion's hand. "Quick, quick," he cried, "let's run away from us, or he will catch us." "Who will catch us?" asked the stranger. "Mr. Toil, the old schoolmaster," Hugh answered. "Don't you see him among the haymakers?" And Hugh pointed to an elderly man who seemed to be the owner of the field. He was busily at work in his shirt sleeves. The drops of sweat stood on his brow, and he kept constantly crying out to his people to make hay while the sun shone. Stranger to say, the features of the old farmer were precisely the same as those of Mr. Toil, who at that very moment should have been entering the schoolroom. "Don't be afraid," said the stranger. "This is not Mr. Toil, the schoolmaster, but a brother of his, who was bred a farmer. He won't trouble you unless you become a laborer on his farm." Well, Hugh believed what his companion had said, but was glad when they were out of sight of the old farmer, who bore such a singular resemblance to Mr. Toil. Well, I'm going to summarize a little bit for you. You get where we're going. Hugh and the stranger went from one place to another after this, and Hugh saw Mr. Toil everywhere. He saw it in carpenters building a house. He saw it in soldiers drilling. He saw it even in a fiddle player playing a feisty tune. It seemed like everywhere they went, Hugh saw something good, but then saw Mr. Toil in the middle of it. And so he complained. He said about Mr. Toil, "Mr. Toil has made himself at home in every cottage and stole under one disguise or another into every most splendid mansion. Everywhere they stumbled on some old schoolmaster's innumerable brothers." And at length Hugh found himself completely worn out with running away from Mr. Toil. Take me back," cried the poor fellow, bursting into tears. "If there is nothing but toil all over the world, I might just as well go back to the schoolhouse." "Yonder is the schoolhouse," said the stranger, for although he and Hugh had walked many steps, they had arrived in a circle back at the schoolhouse. "Come, we will go back together." There was something in his companion's voice that little Hugh now remembered, and it was strange that he had not remembered it sooner. Looking into the face, behold, there again was the likeness of old Mr. Toil. So the poor child had been in the company of Toil all day, even while he had been doing his best to run away from him. So it concludes thusly. Little Hugh Idle, however, had learned a good lesson, and from that time forward was diligent at his task. And because he knew that diligence is not a whit more toilsome than sport or idleness, and when he became better acquainted with Mr. Toil, he began to think his ways were not so disagreeable, and that the old schoolmaster's smile of approbation made his face sometimes appear almost as pleasant as even that of Hugh's mother. Now that's a moral. Love work like you love your mother. Brilliant! But this sort of an ethic is so imbued in our culture everywhere you turn. And it really is something uniquely American and powerful. Some of it good, some of it bad, perhaps. but there is good, I believe, in hard work. Now, this is mythologized into something that's really more than it is in Horatio Alger, the rags to riches story that he wrote. Very, very, very famous stories. Some of the subtitles were The Fortunes of a New York Bootblack, or A Path to New Fortune, or Making His Mark. These were narratives that became self-sustaining myths in America, that anybody could make it through hard work. And interesting, one of the apostles of Horatio Alger actually was the founder of Temple University, Russell Herman Conwell. He gave a speech called Acres of Diamonds. Acres of Diamonds. He gave that speech 6,000 times. And in it he mixed morality and business advice. He went so far as to say that you would be better off if you were born in a poor family than a rich family, because you'd have more of a chance to make something of yourself. Well, you got to be living a comfortable life to believe that. So take that with a grain of salt. But there is something to this myth and these stories in America about hard work. Certainly toil has been romanticized in our culture. I think many parents and schoolmasters and clergy and politicians want good worker bees. So they want to convince us all to be good workers, that's sure. And this is something that my anarchist son Sean pointed out to me as we argued about this talk that I'm writing for today. And maybe he's right. Maybe these values are simply tools of oppression. But I think there's something to them. Certainly, while we figure out what to do with this system to make it better, I think we should look for reasonable government regulations around capitalism that allow some of the good elements associated with that culture to come forward and the ugliness to go to the back. I have some faith that the excesses of capitalism can be curbed through responsible law. One very pro-capitalist member of the Baltimore Ethical Society was excited to hear that your auction is giving them the same talk next week. So they're writing off the system, their welfare. Right? He said this, he said, the rule of law makes free market possible. You have to have laws for that. There's a role for big government, he said, in promoting the general welfare, in anti-pollution laws and public health projects, infrastructure projects, help for disaster victims, and he admitted even for people who are impoverished through no fault of their own. So I want to turn for the last part of my talk to ethical culture's historic relation to capitalism. And although our egregious inequality and our devastation of the environment has radicalized me, our tradition is a more moderate tradition. Take it or leave it. Our humanist predecessors basically believed that the strength of capitalism could be maintained and the weaknesses minimized. Felix Adler, who founded this movement, had a lot of respect, for example, hard work, innovation, industry. I mean, he was a Northern Puritan soul in many, many ways. And he recalled sort of Emerson's love of how people can be turned into these creative creatures. He wrote, "A talent or a gift of this kind is fire in a man's bones, a pressure within him seeking vent. Give it a chance to effectuate itself, and man is content." Adler believed that hard work was a good thing. But Adler also worked with the private sector and with charities and with interfaith groups to moderate the evils of capitalism. He created the visiting nurse service. He started the first free kindergarten, the working men's school, the Child Study Association. He worked with labor leaders, including a member of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, AFL founder Samuel Gompers, to try to work for better wages and conditions and hours for workers. Adler, though, did not demonize business leaders at the same time because he worked with them. He praised hard work and innovation and thrift and industry, and he saw value in rising standards of living. He and other ethical culture members actually were skeptical of socialism, the radicalism of it. There's a historian of ethical culture, David Muzzy, and he cites a 1920 debate between a radical economist named Scott Nearing and Edwin Seligman, who was a member of the New York Society. And this debate was called "Resolve. Capitalism has more to offer labor than socialism." This is a very hot topic in 1920 when Eugene Debs, a socialist candidate for the presidency, got over 1 million votes while he was in prison. Okay? So we were a lot more radical back then. But Muzzy says that Seligman in the debate praised capitalism for its, quote, accumulation of wealth and cheapening of production and multiplication of conveniences, comforts, and even luxuries for the poor, which could not have been dreamt of generations before. As well as, he continues, quote, the democracy called into being by the Industrial Revolution, which was made possible alone by capitalism. So he's again going back to that historic role of capitalism. He didn't deny that there were evils in capitalism like unfair competition and unjust privileges and swollen fortunes, but he said that capitalism was quote-unquote progressive. That's the terms he used, because he believed that it would eliminate its worst evils and improve itself. Now, we got a long way to go, I know, and his debate counterpart, Nearing, said this in the debate. He said that if capitalism is progressive, so are some diseases. But Felix Adler worked hard to minimize the negativeness of capitalism. He wanted to humanize capitalism in a lot of ways, and he did this in all of his works. He worked with the New York State Tenement House Commission, and in that commission, he wasn't demanding the government to build public housing. He was demanding regulations that curbed overcrowding, bad sanitation, the abuse of workers in these situations. Jacob Ree, the muckraker, praised Adler for his works on that commission. It was the excesses that Adler tried to attack, the extreme individualism and the extreme materialism. Because Adler felt like what we had gotten was too focused on stuff, on goods. He criticized conspicuous consumption, shallow consumerism, and he also rejected the deterministic materialism of Marx and socialism that he thought ignored a profound personal and ethical need to grow as a human being. So he rejected individualism, and he rejected it because he believed that that sort of a life denied us integration in our social whole, a more complete lived experience. So that he believed that American capitalism was simply too focused on the individual getting more stuff. But that wasn't all that capitalism had to offer. He thought it could offer us opportunities to improve our ethical, personal, and relational lives as well. He even called it, potentially, democracy within a capitalist system as possibly an avenue for spiritual growth. He demanded that the business leaders serve the public good. In a 1902 arbitration of a labor hearing, he said this: the duty of the employer is to bear the aim of social improvement in mind, and if he can, take a step in that direction. It's the duty of social improvement. It's not just maximization of profits. He started a businessmen's group, the New York Society of Ethical Culture, and met with them regularly to try to get them to soften capitalism. He said that this group was dedicated to, quote, overcoming the, quote, mountains of selfishness and acquisitiveness in order to ethicize our economic life. This group put on an exhibit at the New York Society called Better Industrial Relations, promoted a kinder capitalism. In 1923, he even criticized an American capitalist folk hero. Listen to what he said about this gentleman. He says, take Henry Ford. He's working for efficiency in production, but he's not working for spiritual efficiency. What's that? What would Henry Ford be doing working for spiritual efficiency? Was he naive that capitalism could actually do that? Maybe he was. I mean, this was a man who in 1915, on the eve of a capitalist-inspired war, was still thinking great optimistic thoughts. Listen to what he said on the eve of our entry into World War I. The war had been raging. It's certain that in the commercial world a change is taking place suggestive of a moral awakening, or at least half awakening. I like that. Maybe just half an awakening. Nowadays, nothing is more common than to hear men of affairs admit and even proclaim with some emphasis that they have seen a new light, quote unquote. So Adler saw in business leaders, quote, a new sensitiveness to elementary notions of right and wrong. He pinned his hopes on this sensitivity and moral awakening and believed that when the leaders of industry saw the injustice and inequality in society, when they had a fuller understanding of how the slaving and suffering masses were hurting, and when they understood how they themselves were part of a social whole, that they themselves would reform. He spoke of a, quote, broken self-consciousness of the thoughtful rich. What a weird phrase. The broken self-consciousness of the thoughtful rich. Maybe we need more of that. Now, today. Because he thought that that kind of spiritual pain, if you could get to the heart of the capitalist, that they would seek a way to reform and change the system so that goods were given to more people and nobody starved or was degraded. So to conclude, can some good things in capitalism be embraced by ethical humanists? Well, if these good things are only available to the very few of us who have inherited unearned privilege, like me and many of you, and if individualism ignores interconnectedness, then capitalism has a problem. Then capitalism has failed. So if capitalism is to serve us, if those qualities of industry, thrift, hard work are going to be something that serves us all, we have to not just be consumers and investors, we have to be citizens in an active democracy. Because right now, capitalism is treating us only as citizens and as investors. Robert Reich says this, again, in Super Capitalism. The only way for the citizens in us to trump the consumers and investors in us, note what he says, in order for the citizen in us to trump the investor and consumer in us, the only way to do that is through laws and regulations that make our purchases and investments a social choice, not just a personal one. So if capitalism is about choice, it's not just about choosing what better product to buy. It's about choosing what kind of society we want. Do we want a society that honors the inherent worth of everyone, that builds social relationships and social justice? Do we want what is good about capitalism to be spread, not just for you and me, but to every kid in every marginalized community in every city in this country? Shouldn't everybody in this country have, like the great entrepreneurs of American stories, shouldn't they all be able to innovate like a Franklin or an Edison or a Whitman? Shouldn't they be able to harness the power of nature for the public good? Shouldn't they be able to earn both the profit and the praise for the products of their own industry? I think everybody in this country needs to be a stakeholder owning something of their own life that's not owned by a king or a corporation. And corporate boards have to be open to more people, to more diversity, more women and people of color, and to ethical thinking. I think